The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns, the scent of perfume heavy in the air, mingling with the soft clink of crystal glasses. The laughter of the nobility echoed through the grand hall, but to Lady Eleanor Rivers, it was nothing but an oppressive hum. She stood in the farthest corner, away from the social whirl, her eyes fixed on the polished floor, her breath shallow. The murmurs around her were unmistakable. Not her. The words slithered through the crowd like a snake, a sharp, bitter whisper she had come to dread. It was the same at every gathering, the same cold dismissal, the same unspoken truth. She was nothing here. She glanced up, catching a glimpse of the women who were, in their eyes, worthier than her. They were radiant, poised, a reflection of everything society deemed valuable. And then, through the sea of silk and lace, his presence cut through like a blade. Duke Alexander Knightley entered the ballroom, and the air shifted. Silence seemed to follow him, a ripple of power that made even the most seasoned of lords and ladies straighten their backs. His gaze swept over the crowd, but it didn't linger. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was a force unto himself, a man whose very name could send the room into a hush. Eleanor didn't dare look directly at him. She knew her place, far from the circle of his attention. But even so, she couldn't help herself. Her eyes found his, just for a moment. It was as if time itself had frozen. The world around her blurred, and in that split second, his gaze locked onto hers. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt in his expression. It was as if he had found exactly what he was looking for in the sea of beautiful, noble women. The moment stretched, then snapped back with a sudden, jarring clarity. His footsteps were the only sound that mattered now. Each one echoed like thunder in the silence, a steady rhythm that moved closer and closer. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to look away, but his presence was magnetic, drawing her in despite herself. He was here, in front of her now, and she hadn't moved. The room seemed to still around them, the buzz of conversation muted, as if everyone else had vanished into the background. His eyes were cold, piercing, but there was something else there too, something sharp, like a promise. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His gaze alone had already commanded attention. And then, with the kind of finality that made her skin tingle, he spoke. "It's you." The words, low and deliberate, struck her like a physical blow. Eleanor blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers around her grew louder, but she could barely hear them over the rush of blood in her ears. She had been chosen. Chosen by Duke Alexander Knightley. The room was a whirlwind of disbelief. The shock was palpable, rolling off the gathered nobility in waves. But not a single word was spoken, only gasps, the rustling of silk, the quick shuffle of feet. Eleanor stood frozen, her body unwilling to move, unsure whether this was a dream or some cruel trick of fate. The Duke hadn't even looked at the others. He had walked straight to her. The humiliation she had suffered for years, the quiet, unspoken rejection, suddenly seemed meaningless in this moment. She was seen. She was chosen. But at what cost? The Duke's presence was a quiet storm. Eleanor could feel it, a weight that pressed against her chest. The crowd, still in stunned silence, parted as he stood before her. His gaze, unyielding, never wavered. She had always been invisible in these rooms, a shadow among stars, but now, under the Duke's scrutiny, she was the center of the universe. Every nerve in her body was alive with tension, but her feet remained rooted to the marble floor, her body betraying her mind's desire to flee. Duke Alexander Knightley was not a man who would tolerate hesitation. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with purposeful strides. The soft rustle of his boots on the floor echoed like a drumbeat, setting the rhythm of her heart. His presence overwhelmed her, filling the space, commanding attention. Eleanor could hear her breath, shallow and ragged, but she could not force herself to speak. The power dynamic had shifted. In the span of a heartbeat, she was no longer the girl discarded by society, but the one chosen by the Duke. It was dizzying. She could feel the eyes of the room upon her, the noble women who had always looked down on her, the men who had never given her a second glance. They were watching now, waiting for her to falter, to prove them right. But she would not. Not now. Not when Duke Knightley was looking at her with that unwavering gaze. He took another step forward, his presence so close now that she could feel the heat of his body. She had to look up to meet his eyes, and when she did, the world seemed to narrow to just him. His jaw was set, his features hard as granite, yet his eyes held a flicker of something deeper, something unreadable. He did not speak immediately, and the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Every part of her screamed to break it, to say something, anything, but she held her tongue. In that silence, she could hear the faintest sound, the brush of fabric, the intake of breath. And then, just as she was certain she would crumble under the weight of it all, he spoke. His voice was low, not loud, but commanding in its quietness. "You've been invisible long enough." The words hung in the air, heavy with the force of 1,000 unspoken truths. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Was this a trick? Was he mocking her? She searched his face, but found no trace of amusement, only the steady resolve of a man who had made up his mind. He wasn't mocking her. He was acknowledging her. For the first time, she wasn't being dismissed. She wasn't a shadow. She was the choice. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against the shore, sweeping away everything she had known about herself. She was the chosen one. But at what cost? The room around them seemed to blur, the chatter and laughter fading into nothingness as her mind raced. She wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mouth felt dry, her throat tight. Duke Knightley was still watching her, waiting. His eyes never left hers. He raised his hand, and the motion was so deliberate, so controlled, that for a moment, Eleanor forgot to breathe. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, sending a shock of heat through her. It was a small gesture, yet it held all the weight of the world. The crowd held its collective breath, and Eleanor could feel every eye trained on them. The touch was not possessive. It was not tender. It was a declaration. She belonged here, in this space, with him. The power shift was undeniable, but Eleanor was still unsure of her place in it. Was she truly worthy of this attention? Was it her strength or his need that had drawn him to her? She didn't have time to question it. Duke Knightley's presence was like a magnet, and she couldn't look away. "Come with me," he said, his voice still quiet but firm, as though it was not a request but an order. She didn't know if she should follow or if she was meant to resist, but she didn't have the strength to do either. All she knew was that, in this moment, everything had changed. The man who had been nothing more than a distant figure in her mind was now in front of her, pulling her into a world that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Without a word, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The Duke's gaze softened, ever so slightly, as he led her away from the crowd. She walked beside him, her heart racing, knowing that from this moment on, she would never be the same. The ballroom was a blur of movement, the soft rustling of gowns, the clinking of glasses, but to Eleanor, everything felt distant, muffled, as if she were living in a dream. Duke Alexander Knightley led her through the sea of glittering nobility, and with every step, the air thickened, heavy with unspoken judgment. They passed through the crowd, but the world seemed to stop at the edges of their small circle. He was the only thing that mattered, and she couldn't quite understand why he had chosen her. Her heart was still racing, the echoes of his touch on her arm lingering like fire. His presence was overwhelming, a constant reminder that she no longer belonged in the shadows. As they walked, the room around them seemed to fall away. Eleanor could feel the eyes of the guests on them, the whispers growing louder, but they did nothing to slow the Duke's purposeful stride. His eyes never left hers, not even when they passed the gathering of nobles who had once dismissed her as insignificant. She could feel their silent disapproval, but it wasn't for her anymore. It was for him, for daring to choose her. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but there was something else, something new. A flicker of excitement, an undeniable pull. When Duke Knightley stopped in front of a private alcove, the tension in the air shifted. His hand brushed the small of her back, guiding her into the dimly lit space. The movement was swift, almost imperceptible, but it felt like the world had shifted in that moment. He didn't speak at first, his gaze moving over her, taking in every detail. It was unsettling, the way he looked at her, like he could see through her, past the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. Her pulse quickened as his gaze softened, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. He didn't need to say a word. His presence was enough to make her feel as if the whole room was holding its breath. She was acutely aware of every inch of her body now, the way her skin prickled under the heat of his stare, the way her heart seemed to beat louder the closer he came. She was standing on the edge, but she didn't know what would happen when she fell. His fingers brushed her arm again, just lightly, but the contact sent a wave of warmth through her, a stark contrast to the chill in the air. He stepped even closer, his presence enveloping her. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind, but her body remained still. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that kept her rooted to the spot. Duke Knightley wasn't like any man she had ever met. There was a coldness to him, a calm detachment that made it impossible to predict his next move. Yet, in this moment, there was no question in his eyes. He was in control, and she was a part of his plan, whether she understood it or not. As he leaned in, the tension between them thickened, building with every second that passed. His breath was warm against her ear as he whispered, "You're not invisible anymore." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had ever wanted. To be seen, to be chosen. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment she stepped into his world, she was already losing a part of herself. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say. There was nothing left for her to say. The game had already been decided. He had chosen her. Eleanor was no longer the girl in the shadows, the one discarded by society. But as the Duke's fingers gently cupped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze, she realized that the power dynamic had shifted completely. She was his now, whether she liked it or not. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she felt as if the ground beneath her might give way. "Do you understand?" Duke Knightley's voice was low, dangerous, yet the question was a simple one. She nodded slowly, unable to look away from him. But in that moment, she wasn't sure if she understood anything at all. The Duke's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stepped back, just a fraction, enough to break the tension but not the connection. "Good," he murmured. His eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer before he turned, leading her once more through the ballroom. The eyes of the crowd still fixed on them, but this time, it was different. They were no longer the only ones watching. The world was watching, and Eleanor had no idea what would happen next. The crowd was a buzz of whispers and glances as Duke Alexander Knightley led Eleanor through the ballroom once more. But this time, there was a shift in the air, an undeniable tension that hung between them. Her heart beat loudly in her chest, but she kept her head high, walking with him through the sea of aristocrats who once would have never spared her a second glance. Now, they were all watching, judging, waiting. She was no longer the forgotten woman on the outskirts of society. She was the chosen one. The power had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Duke Knightley's cold, calculating gaze swept over the crowd. But there was something else now, something different in the way the room responded to him. Eleanor couldn't help but feel it. They were all aware of the choices he had made, and they didn't like it. Her heart raced as they approached the center of the ballroom. The murmurs grew louder, but no one dared to speak directly to him. He had claimed her, Lady Eleanor Rivers, the daughter of a fallen family, and in that single act, he had defied everything they had believed. The women in the room, once so secure in their positions, suddenly seemed to shrink, their poised smiles faltering. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, their envy, but she held her ground. She was no longer invisible. As they reached the center, Duke Knightley stopped. The room stilled, every conversation dying, every eye trained on them. He didn't speak at first, he didn't need to. The simple act of him standing next to her was enough. He was a towering presence, while she stood beside him, a stark contrast. The power dynamics were clear, but in that silence, something shifted. Eleanor felt a sudden, uncomfortable tightness in her chest. The eyes of the room burned into her, and for a moment, she wanted to run, to escape the suffocating attention. But she didn't. She couldn't. The Duke's fingers brushed her arm, the simple touch sending a shock through her body. His hand lingered just a moment longer than necessary, his grip firm but not possessive. The tension was thick now, a simmering undercurrent that neither of them could deny. The whispers continued to swell, rising into a cacophony of judgment and disbelief. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to protest, to scream at them all that she wasn't their puppet to be played with, but she knew better. She had been chosen, and she couldn't undo it. Duke Knightley, his eyes unwavering, turned to face the room. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but to Eleanor, it was as if the very fabric of reality had changed. She wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. The aristocrats around them were beginning to stir, their discomfort palpable. The whispers turned into mutters, then into a full-on hum of discontent. There was no mistaking it now. Eleanor had been marked. The Duke's voice, cold and commanding, finally broke the silence. "We are not here to listen to the thoughts of the unworthy," he said, his tone sharp and final. His words hung in the air, and Eleanor could feel the weight of them settling over her like a heavy cloak. He wasn't just speaking to the room. He was speaking to her, too. The power he wielded over her was undeniable. But in that moment, Eleanor couldn't decide if it made her feel small or significant. The crowd stood frozen, their discomfort mingling with the growing sense of tension. But then, the Duke did something unexpected. He took her hand, his grip firm yet oddly gentle, and pulled her closer. The shift in the room was palpable. Everyone watched as they moved. Every step they took now watched and weighed. She felt the eyes on them, felt the disdain of the women who once would have been the ones standing at the Duke's side. But now, they were nothing more than spectators. The power dynamic had shifted once more, and Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. She was the one standing at his side, the one whose hand he held as they moved through the crowd. She was the one they all whispered about now. The power was hers too, but at what cost? As the Duke led her away from the crowd, Eleanor's mind raced. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. All she knew was that her world had irrevocably changed in a way she wasn't sure she could ever fully understand. But one thing was certain, she was no longer invisible. And that fact terrified her more than anything. The ballroom had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with whispers and judgment. The nobility, once unshaken in their positions, now turned their eyes towards Duke Alexander Knightley and Eleanor, watching their every move. Her hand, still held firmly in his, felt both like a lifeline and a chain. The Duke led her through the crowd, his presence impossible to ignore, his stature towering over the sea of aristocrats. The room seemed to contract around them, narrowing in on their every interaction. Eleanor could feel the weight of the stares, the silent critique from the women who had once seen her as beneath them. She had always been invisible to them, the girl who didn't matter, the one they whispered about. But now, as she walked at the Duke's side, their whispers were louder, sharper. "She's nothing like the others. What is he doing with her?" The words were venomous, but they were also filled with disbelief. Duke Knightley's eyes, cold and calculating, never faltered. He didn't flinch at the comments, nor did he acknowledge them. He simply continued moving, his grip on Eleanor's hand unyielding. The tension was palpable. Each step they took was a statement in itself, an assertion of power, of control. The women, the men, they were all watching, but it was as though they were looking at her for the first time, as if they could no longer deny her presence. The very air seemed to hum with the energy of the room, as if every eye was turned on them, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to show weakness. But she didn't. The Duke, however, was a different matter. Eleanor could feel the power radiating from him, a quiet storm that shook the room without him ever needing to raise his voice. His movements were deliberate, calculated, and every glance he cast her way seemed to pierce through her very soul. She was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't fully grasp. But in this moment, as the Duke held her hand, she felt something she had never felt before, visible. Her presence, once a shadow, now demanded attention. Duke Knightley's grip tightened ever so slightly, a subtle gesture that sent a jolt through her body. His gaze flicked over her, and she felt exposed, laid bare for the first time in her life. She wasn't just his companion in that moment. She was his declaration. The very act of her standing beside him sent a ripple through the room. People began to shift uncomfortably, but none dared to challenge him. Eleanor, despite herself, felt her chest swell with a strange mixture of pride and fear. It was as though she had been given a key to a world she had never belonged to. But it was a world that demanded more than she could give. The power dynamic had shifted, but now she had to learn how to navigate it. They reached the center of the room, and for a moment, It was as if the world around them ceased to exist. Duke Knightley paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a quiet authority. The room held its breath. His fingers brushed her arm, the touch brief but deliberate, like a promise that only she could understand. It was an acknowledgement, not of her place by his side, but of the subtle power he wielded over her. The crowd watched, breathless, as Duke Knightley's voice broke the silence. "This is where you belong now," he said, his words calm, but filled with undeniable weight. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. It was not a question. It was a statement. And she knew, deep down, that she had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The women around her, those who had once held the power to make or break her, now seemed like distant figures, their influence no longer able to touch her. She was in the Duke's world now, and in that world, she was no longer the one who had been overlooked. She was the one who had been chosen. But as the weight of his words sank in, so did the realization that being chosen was not without its consequences. Eleanor was no longer a shadow in the corner of the ballroom. She was the center of attention, and that attention was a double-edged sword. She was no longer just Eleanor Rivers, the daughter of a disgraced noble family. She was the Duke's companion, a position that came with its own set of expectations and dangers. As the Duke led her to a more secluded corner of the ballroom, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her back, their judgment, their curiosity, all of it focused on her. The power had shifted, but it wasn't just hers. She was now a part of the Duke's world, and in that world, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Eleanor's pulse raced as she walked beside him, each step bringing her deeper into the unknown. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of their shared secret hanging heavy in the air. The ballroom had become a stage, and she, unwittingly, was playing her part. But she wasn't sure how long she could keep up the facade. The power dynamic was clear. The Duke was in control, and she was his chosen, but Eleanor couldn't help but wonder just how much of herself she would lose in the process. The Duke's grip on her hand tightened once more, and she knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The room was thick with tension as Duke Alexander Knightley and Eleanor moved through the ballroom. Their footsteps, though elegant, echoed like a constant reminder of the power shift between them. The crowd, once teeming with idle chatter and laughter, now stood still, their gazes trained on the Duke and the woman at his side. Eleanor felt every eye, every whisper, like a burning brand against her skin. She had always been on the periphery, but now, she was a part of the center of attention, and the weight of it was suffocating. The women who had once looked down on her, the men who had never taken her seriously, were all watching, waiting for her to falter. Her heart raced, and her grip on the Duke's arm tightened ever so slightly, but he didn't flinch. His presence was commanding, unwavering. He was a man used to controlling the room with just a glance. As they continued their path through the ballroom, Eleanor could feel the subtle shift in the air. The space between them and the crowd seemed to widen, but in that widening gap, the power dynamic between her and the Duke grew more and more pronounced. The Duke led her to the front, to the center of the gathering where the aristocracy stood watching, and as he stopped, so did the rest of the room. It was as though time itself had stopped, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor found herself suspended in this stillness. The Duke's fingers lightly brushed her arm again, a small gesture, but one that sent a ripple of heat through her body. His gaze didn't leave her as he spoke to the crowd, his voice low and steady, yet it carried the weight of 100 unspoken rules. "This is where she belongs now," he said, his words slicing through the air like a blade. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest as the eyes of the nobility bore into her. She could feel the judgment, the disapproval, the disbelief radiating from them. She was no longer a shadow, no longer the forgotten one. The Duke had chosen her, but as his words echoed in her mind, so did the weight of their consequences. The power that he wielded, the control he had over this moment, was undeniable. But it was not just the Duke's power that was in play now. It was hers, too. The power she had never known, the power she now had to learn how to handle. As they stood together, Eleanor felt the sharp divide between them and the rest of the room. They were no longer just spectators. They were part of the game. But Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to play. "I should never have been here," she thought. But she couldn't stop herself from standing tall, from facing the scrutiny head-on. She had been given a place at his side, but that place came with a price. Her mind raced, her thoughts were a blur, but her body stayed still, like a statue, her breath slow and controlled. The Duke turned to her then, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if reading the thoughts that flickered across her face. He knew what she was feeling. He always did. His hand, cold and sure, reached for hers again, this time pulling her gently, but with unmistakable force, toward the dance floor. The shift was instantaneous. The nobility parted to make way for them, their murmurs intensifying. The Duke didn't acknowledge anyone else. His focus was entirely on Eleanor. As they moved to the center, Eleanor's breath caught. The music played, soft and melodic, but it was the space between them that felt like the real dance. Her steps were uncertain at first, but the Duke's lead was firm, guiding her with steady, unspoken command. She followed, unsure of where she was headed, but unable to stop herself. His hand at the small of her back, warm and commanding, made her spine stiffen, but it also steadied her. The tension between them swelled, thick and palpable, as they moved in sync across the floor. Eleanor could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, but it was the Duke's gaze that held her captive. Every step they took felt like a silent declaration, one that no one could ignore. She wasn't just his companion anymore. She was a part of something much larger, something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Do not look away, the Duke's gaze seemed to say, and so she didn't. She couldn't. The pressure of his presence, the weight of the eyes on them, only intensified the more they moved. The music swelled, but it was the silence between the notes that made Eleanor's heart race. Her pulse, loud and erratic, filled her ears as they danced, their bodies close but not touching too much. She could feel the power of his touch, of his control, and the pull between them that neither of them could deny. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't escape the question that lingered in her thoughts. Was she truly chosen, or was she just a pawn in the Duke's game? The room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing around them. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind, but her body followed the Duke's lead, each step more confident than the last. As the music reached its crescendo, she realized that this moment, this dance, was everything. It was a declaration of everything she had never been, seen, chosen, marked. But it was also a test of who she was and who she was becoming. The Duke's grip tightened, pulling her closer, but the tension between them remained unresolved, a constant pulse, a question she didn't yet have the answer to. What would happen when the music stopped? The music faded into a low hum, but the tension in the ballroom only grew sharper. Duke Alexander Knightley and Eleanor stood at the center, the crowd circling them like sharks. His grip on her hand tightened, pulling her closer, their bodies now pressed together in a delicate, controlled dance. Eleanor could feel the heat from his touch, the power in his every move, and yet, there was an undeniable undercurrent of discomfort that swept through her. She was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. She was his chosen, and every eye in the room was fixed upon her. The women, once the pillars of grace and elegance, now watched her with something far less flattering: envy, disdain, and disbelief. They whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but unmistakable. Eleanor could feel the weight of their judgment, each whisper an accusation that burned like fire. They didn't know her, they didn't care to, but the Duke had chosen her, and that fact alone was enough to shift the entire social order. She could hear the subtle shift in their voices, the way the room had stilled in their presence. The Duke, never one for grand gestures, simply held her, his eyes sweeping over the room with a quiet dominance that left no room for objection. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to keep her composure, but she couldn't help but feel exposed. His fingers brushed lightly against her back, and it was enough to send a shiver up her spine. His touch was gentle, but the power it conveyed was undeniable. She could feel the eyes of the men, too, their gaze sharp and calculating. There was no respect in their looks, only a quiet measure of her worth now that she was aligned with the Duke. She stood there, a mere pawn in their game, but one that had been chosen to stand at the right hand of the most powerful man in the room. The pressure of it all was almost too much to bear, but she didn't allow herself to falter. She couldn't. The Duke's presence was a constant reminder that she had a place in this world now, whether she was ready for it or not. They continued to move through the crowd, and with each step, the walls of the ballroom seemed to close in. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a blur. What had she become? Was she truly ready for this world of power and privilege? Could she ever truly belong? And yet, even as the doubts clouded her thoughts, she couldn't deny the flicker of excitement deep within her. She was no longer an outsider. She had a place here, by the Duke's side. But the deeper she fell into his world, the more she realized that power was a double-edged sword. As they walked, Duke Knightley's hand never left her side, his grip steady and sure. He led her through the crowd with a quiet grace, and every movement seemed deliberate, measured. The room responded to him without question. They parted for him, made way for him, their eyes following him as if he were the only man who mattered. And in that moment, it became painfully clear he was the only one who did. As they reached the far end of the ballroom, Duke Knightley stopped once again, his eyes scanning the crowd. The whispers grew louder, but he paid them no mind. His attention was solely on Eleanor now. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and the tension between them was palpable. Every step, every movement, seemed to pull them closer together, yet the space between them remained charged with an unspoken conflict. He had chosen her, but she didn't know if she had the strength to stand in his world, to bear the weight of his expectations. The Duke's hand reached for her chin, lifting it gently, forcing her to look into his eyes. The room seemed to fade away. The noise, the whispers, the disapproving glances, they all disappeared. There was only him, his touch, his gaze, and the power he wielded over her. "You are mine now," he said, his voice low and steady, as if confirming a truth they both already knew. The words, simple but powerful, sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that caused the tremor in her hands, but she didn't dare break eye contact. He had claimed her, and in that moment, it was impossible to deny it. But even as she stood before him, her heart racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. The power had shifted, and she had been drawn into a world where everything was measured by the Duke's hand. She had been chosen, but at what cost? She didn't know, but the silence between them, thick and heavy, seemed to echo her uncertainty. The Duke's eyes softened ever so slightly, and in that instant, Eleanor understood. He knew. He knew the conflict she was feeling, the tension that gripped her heart. And yet, there was no comfort in his gaze, only the unrelenting truth of her new reality. She was his. There was no going back. The tension between them hung in the air, unresolved and thick. She couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that this was just the beginning of a new world, one she wasn't sure she was ready for, but one she was now irrevocably a part of. The ballroom was alive with music, but to Eleanor, it was nothing more than a distant hum, drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. The Duke's presence was a storm, sweeping her up into something she wasn't sure she could control. He was still holding her close, his hand at the small of her back, a steady pressure that made her feel both secure and trapped at once. Every step they took was deliberate, as though he were marking his territory, guiding her to the center of attention, showing the world exactly where she belonged, or where he had decided she belonged. The whispers were relentless, louder now, sharper. Eleanor could feel the weight of them, each word like a stone thrown at her, each glance like a dagger aimed at her heart. She wasn't sure how long she could keep up this charade, how long she could stand next to him without losing herself entirely. But it didn't matter. He had chosen her, and now, she was his, whether she wanted to be or not. As they approached the center of the room, the crowd parted before them like the sea before a storm. Every eye was on them, and Eleanor's stomach twisted with the realization that she was no longer an outsider. She was the center of their attention, the subject of their judgment. The Duke's grip on her tightened slightly, his fingers pressing into her skin, grounding her, reminding her of her place in this world. But the pressure in her chest grew heavier, the weight of their stares suffocating. Her eyes flicked around the room, taking in the faces of the nobility. The women, their eyes narrowed in envy. The men, their gazes calculating and cold. She was the one they whispered about now, the one they judged. And the Duke? He stood beside her, completely unmoved by it all, as though none of it mattered. But it did. It mattered to her. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could suffocate her, yet she couldn't look away from him. His cold, unwavering gaze was fixed on her, and in that moment, Eleanor knew he was aware of every thought swirling in her head. The power dynamics had shifted so drastically, so suddenly, and she wasn't sure she could keep up. The Duke stepped closer, his breath warm against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "Do not look away," he whispered, his voice low and commanding. His words were a subtle order, but she didn't need to be told twice. She was already too far in, too entangled. In this game to back out now. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. There was no ballroom, no crowd, no whispers, just him. But the silence between them was deafening, the tension too much to bear. The pressure in the air grew, the space between them charged with something Eleanor couldn't name. She was caught, trapped between desire and fear, between the intoxicating pull of the Duke's power and the suffocating weight of expectation. His hand, still on her back, gave a small push, guiding her forward, his steps purposeful, and with each one, the crowd watched in rapt silence. But Eleanor felt the invisible weight of the eyes on her, felt the judgment, the disbelief that they couldn't keep hidden anymore. She was no longer the girl they had once ignored. She was the girl who had been chosen, and that made her a target in their eyes. As they continued to move, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her steps faltering for just a moment. The Duke's hand immediately adjusted, steadying her, but it was the look he gave her that made her heart race. It was a silent warning, a reminder that she was under his watch, that she couldn't afford to slip up. The room was closing in, the space between them growing more intimate with each step. Eleanor was acutely aware of the way their bodies moved together, the way the Duke's hand never left her side, guiding her through the tension and the chaos. She was his, and that fact felt both liberating and terrifying. The weight of their connection was undeniable. As they reached the far end of the ballroom, the Duke finally stopped, his posture still commanding, his eyes scanning the crowd. But there was no mistaking the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the room, like the rest of the world didn't exist. Eleanor's breath caught as he turned to face her fully, his hand still on her back, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down, the noise fading into the background, leaving just the two of them in the center of it all. "You are mine," he said, his voice low and almost too calm. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement, a declaration of ownership, and in that moment, Eleanor knew there was no turning back. She was his. But the question that burned in her mind, the question that she couldn't shake, was whether she wanted to be. The room seemed to close in on her, the crowd now a blur around them, but the Duke remained solid, unmoving, like a rock in the storm. And as she stood there, caught between the storm of her own thoughts and the calm certainty of his presence, Eleanor realized that everything had changed. There was no escaping this now. She was a part of his world, and that world would never be the same again. The music swelled to a crescendo, but Eleanor could hardly hear it over the pounding of her own heart. The ballroom around them had become a blur, the faces of the nobility a hazy backdrop to the undeniable tension that crackled in the air between her and Duke Alexander Knightley. His presence was a storm, his grip on her hand steady and firm, pulling her along as though she had no choice but to follow him. But she wasn't sure anymore if she wanted to. They had crossed a line, and now the room was alive with whispers and stares that cut through her like knives. Every move they made together was calculated, deliberate, as though he were marking her as his own. The power dynamic had shifted, and she felt it in every fiber of her being. But now, as the moment stretched between them, Eleanor couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that she was losing herself. The Duke had claimed her, chosen her, but at what cost? They moved to the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting in silence as they passed, their eyes locked on the pair of them. The world seemed to freeze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. Duke Knightley's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and intense as they met hers. But there was something else there now, something deeper. There was power in his gaze, but there was also something cold, something calculated. His grip on her tightened, pulling her closer, until their bodies were nearly flush against each other. The room seemed to close in on them, the tension thick and suffocating, the noise from the crowd now a distant hum. Eleanor's chest tightened with the weight of it all. She had never felt so exposed, so naked, in front of so many people. But she couldn't look away. Not from him. The Duke's hand brushed her cheek, the touch almost too soft, too gentle, for the power that was radiating from him. And then, without a word, he took a step back, breaking the space between them just enough to create an electric charge in the air. The crowd held its breath, and so did Eleanor, her heart beating wildly in her chest. The moment hung suspended in time, frozen in place like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. But it didn't. Instead, Duke Knightley spoke, his voice a low growl that only she could hear. "Do you know what you've done?" The words were sharp, cutting through her like a blade, and Eleanor felt them deep in her bones. "I've given you everything," he continued, his eyes boring into hers. "And yet, you're still here, questioning me." Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She wasn't sure what she had expected from him, but it wasn't this. She wasn't sure what she had expected from herself either. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes flicking between them, the tension in the room building with every passing second. She had been chosen, marked by the Duke, but now, with his words hanging in the air between them, she wasn't sure if she was the one who had been chosen or the one being used. The crowd was waiting for her to crumble, to break, to prove them all right. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Her chin lifted, and for the first time, Eleanor met the Duke's gaze without flinching. "You've given me nothing," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. The words hung in the air between them, suspended for a beat longer than it should have been. The tension in the room snapped, and Eleanor could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer just a game between the two of them. It was a game of power, a game of survival. And for the first time since she had been brought into his world, Eleanor understood. The Duke wasn't the only one with power here. The power had shifted between them once again, but this time, it was different. The crowd could feel it, too. The aristocrats who had once whispered about her, dismissed her, now watched with bated breath. The air crackled with a new energy, one of defiance, one that Eleanor had never known she was capable of. She had been invisible once, a shadow in the corner of the room, but now, standing beside Duke Knightley, she was something else. She was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was a player. And with that realization came a surge of power, something deep inside her that she had never known existed. Duke Knightley's expression softened, but only for a moment. He was studying her, evaluating her. And for a second, Eleanor thought she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "You are not the same," he said, his voice low, almost amused. But the words were laced with something darker. The room was holding its breath again, waiting for the next move, the next twist. And Eleanor? She didn't know if she was ready for what came next, but she knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The moment they shared, charged with tension and unspoken promises, had changed everything. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if the Duke had claimed her, or if she had claimed him. The ballroom was thick with tension, the music now a distant hum against the rapid beating of Eleanor's heart. The Duke's grip on her arm remained unyielding, a steady force that kept her close as they stood at the center of the room. The whispers around them had grown louder, more insistent, as the nobility watched them like hawks circling prey. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, the judgment, the disbelief, but she stood firm, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The power dynamic had shifted, she knew that. But what she didn't know was just how much it had shifted. Duke Alexander Knightley's presence, commanding and stoic, filled the space around them. But Eleanor could feel something in the air, a quiet tension that told her the game wasn't over yet. The Duke's eyes, usually so unreadable, flickered with something else now, something almost dangerous. His jaw was set, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a quiet authority, but there was a sharpness in his movements that she hadn't noticed before. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke turned toward her, his hand reaching out to brush her cheek with the gentlest of touches. For a moment, everything else faded. The noise, the whispers, the eyes, they all disappeared. It was just him and her, standing in the center of the storm. "You think you know your place," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Eleanor blinked, the words sending a shiver down her spine. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she didn't have time to question it. The Duke's gaze was penetrating, like he could see through her, reading her every thought. He wasn't just a man of power. He was the man who controlled everything in this room. He controlled her now, too. She had known that from the moment he had chosen her, but the reality of it was only now sinking in. He was not just her protector. He was not just the man who had claimed her. He was the one who held all the cards, and she was at his mercy. But as his fingers brushed her skin again, she realized something. There was a deeper power at play here, one that she hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't just his pawn in a game of politics and social order. She was the key to his power, just as he was to hers. The thought sent a shiver through her, a mix of fear and excitement that left her breathless. The room was still, and she could feel the eyes on them, the aristocrats waiting for the next move, the next word. But the Duke remained silent, his gaze still locked on her. It was as if the entire world was waiting for him to make his next move. And then, as if sensing her growing uncertainty, the Duke took a step back, his grip loosening on her arm. The sudden distance between them was sharp, like a shock to her system. "You think I chose you because of your beauty or your grace?" His voice was cold, but there was an edge to it now, something darker that she hadn't heard before. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze. Her breath shallow. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she knew he wasn't finished. "You are not here for any of those things," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are here because you are the only one who can bear the weight of what comes next." The words hit her like a punch, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had always thought her life had been a series of misfortunes, a series of being overlooked, underestimated. But now, in this moment, with the Duke's words hanging in the air between them, she realized that there was something more, something she had never considered. The power she had felt when he chose her, when he pulled her into this world, was not just a reflection of her worth. It was a reflection of the power they shared. The realization made her dizzy, but before she could fully grasp it, the Duke stepped closer once more, his hand resting gently on her back, guiding her once again through the sea of watching eyes. The power between them was undeniable, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a part of something bigger than herself, something that was shifting, that was changing. But the question still lingered. What was the cost of this power? What was the cost of standing at his side? As they walked, the crowd parted once more, the whispers rising to a crescendo as the Duke moved through them with ease, his every step commanding respect. But Eleanor could feel it now, the tension in the air, the shift in the power dynamic. She was no longer just by his side. She was part of the story now. She was part of the game, and the stakes were higher than she had ever realized. The Duke's voice broke the silence once again, low and steady. "I didn't bring you here to make you feel small." His words sent a jolt through her, a spark of something she couldn't name. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't just dominance. It was a deeper understanding, something that made her chest tighten with uncertainty. "I brought you here because you have a role to play," he continued, his grip tightening ever so slightly on her hand. "And you will. Play it, whether you like it or not." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she was ready for what was coming. She had been chosen, but what did that truly mean? The tension between them built, and as they reached the far side of the ballroom, she could feel the power between them shifting once again. She was no longer just a woman who had been chosen. She was now part of something larger, and she didn't know if she was ready for it. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The Duke had claimed her, and she was his, whether she wanted to be or not. The ballroom was heavy with anticipation, the space around Eleanor and Duke nightly growing taut, as if the very air had thickened. Every step they took was deliberate, measured. Yet, beneath the surface, something was about to crack wide open. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, and the guests, once respectful, now cast their eyes with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Eleanor could feel the change in the room, a slow crescendo building to a breaking point. Duke Knightley's hand was firm on her back, steady, a constant reminder of the power he held over her. But now, something was different. The power was no longer just his. The power had shifted. His gaze never wavered from her as they moved across the room, but she could feel it now, a distance between them that hadn't been there before. There was a new tension, one that went beyond the eyes of the crowd, one that pulsed in the very space between their bodies. She could hear the subtle crackle of energy, the rising sense of inevitability. The moment was coming, and Eleanor wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The Duke stopped abruptly, and the room seemed to pause with him. Time stretched for a heartbeat, and she could feel the air grow still. His fingers tightened on her arm, a subtle command, and she turned to face him fully. His expression, usually so controlled, was now a mask of cold certainty. He was watching her, waiting for something, waiting for her to understand, perhaps. "You've made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made her heart skip. The words hit her like a slap. Mistake? What mistake? She didn't know what he meant. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the danger in his tone. His eyes locked onto hers, his gaze sharp, penetrating. "You thought you had a choice," he continued, his voice softer now, but laced with something darker. "You thought that by standing beside me, you could take control. But you were wrong." Eleanor's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. She had felt it, this slow shift in the power dynamic between them, but she hadn't realized just how far it had gone, how much she had allowed herself to believe that she was in control, that she could navigate this world with her own rules. She had been a pawn all along, and now, the realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had thought the Duke had chosen her, but in truth, it was he who had set her on a path she could not escape. The truth was plain now, more devastating than any whisper or glance in the ballroom. She had been manipulated, molded into his vision, and now, with every word that came from his mouth, she could see the full extent of his control. His hand on her arm tightened once more, pulling her closer. The Duke's face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin, but there was no comfort in it. Only the weight of his power, the cold certainty that she was no longer just his companion. She was part of his game, and now it was time for the final move. "You thought you were safe, standing by me," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "But there is no safety here, Eleanor. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, their meaning sinking deep into her chest. There was no escape. She had thought that standing by him had given her power, but in truth, it had only made her a part of his plan, a plan she couldn't undo. She could feel the eyes of the room on them, but all she could focus on was the Duke. His presence was overwhelming, consuming, and in that moment, she knew, this was the moment that would change everything. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the tension between them grew tighter. And then, with one swift movement, the Duke released his grip on her arm, his hand pulling away, leaving her standing there, exposed. She could feel the absence of his touch like a cold, empty space. For a brief, dizzying second, she was alone in the center of it all, standing in the eye of the storm. But the Duke wasn't finished. He stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers, as if waiting for her to understand the final truth of the situation. "You are no longer the girl in the shadows," he said, his words final, unyielding. "You are now part of my world, for better or worse." Eleanor's mind reeled. She had known, on some level, that there was a cost to standing at his side. But now, with the full weight of the truth crashing down on her, she realized the true cost of this power, of this world she had been drawn into. The Duke had taken her from the shadows, had given her a place by his side, but in doing so, he had bound her to his world. A world where there was no place for weakness, no room for her own desires, her own ambitions. She was his, and there was no escaping it now. The crowd around them watched in stunned silence, but Eleanor could hardly hear them. All she could hear was the thudding of her own heart, the rush of blood in her ears, as the reality of her situation set in. She wasn't in control. Not anymore. She had been chosen, yes, but not as a partner. She had been chosen as a piece in his game. The Duke's words echoed in her mind. For better or worse. The room was still. The power dynamic had shifted, but now, it was clear, it wasn't hers to command. And as she stood there, in the center of it all, Eleanor knew that the game had only just begun. The tension in the ballroom was almost unbearable, the weight of unspoken words and shifting glances making the air feel heavy, like a storm just before it breaks. Duke Alexander Knightley stood before Eleanor, his presence as commanding as ever, but something had shifted between them, something unspoken, yet undeniable. His grip on her wrist was firm, not as possessive as before, but purposeful. The power he held over her was clear, yet Eleanor could feel a strange shift within herself. She had been the one, caught in his game, the one who had been manipulated into a role she never asked for. But now, as they stood in the eye of the storm, she was beginning to understand just how much of this game she had been playing too. She wasn't just his pawn anymore. She was part of this world, this dangerous dance. The room had quieted, and the crowd's attention was fixed upon them, watching for any sign of weakness, any crack in their composure. The aristocrats who had once whispered about Eleanor, judged her, were now silent, their eyes glued to the two of them in the center of the ballroom. The Duke's gaze never wavered from hers, his eyes dark and unreadable, yet there was something new in them, a flicker of something she couldn't place. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps it was recognition, or perhaps it was something even deeper, something more dangerous. Eleanor didn't know, but she felt it, and it made her heart race in a way she couldn't quite explain. His hand released her wrist, but he didn't step back. Instead, he reached for her chin, his touch gentle, almost tender, as he tilted her head up to meet his gaze. The movement was slow, deliberate, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to slow, as if the ballroom itself held its breath. "You've learned something, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had learned so much in these past few days, about the Duke, about herself, and about the power that coursed through this world she had been thrust into. But the question hung in the air, unresolved, a challenge. She wasn't sure how to respond. "I've learned that you control everything," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. The Duke's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't triumphant. It was simply the truth. "Yes," he said, his voice cool, measured. "But you've also learned that you have more power than you realize. Power I never gave you." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The realization hit her like a wave, and suddenly everything clicked into place. She had been trying to navigate this world by following his lead, by playing by his rules. But now, standing in front of him, she saw something else. She was not a mere reflection of his power. She was a part of it. The power she had been given, the power to stand at his side, to command the room with him, was hers to wield, not just his to control. She was not the girl she once was, the one who had been overlooked and cast aside. She had fought for her place here, and now she understood that she was no longer just a piece in the Duke's game. She was a player in her own right. The realization hit her like a surge of electricity. She stepped back, not in fear, but in understanding. The crowd around them held its breath, watching her every move, but she didn't care. She was no longer bound by their expectations. She wasn't just the Duke's companion. She was Eleanor Rivers, and she had earned her place. The Duke's gaze flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, as if he had seen the change in her too. For a moment, the tension between them was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. But then, without a word, he stepped back, his hand falling away from her chin. His expression softened, just slightly, but it was enough to send a tremor through her chest. "You've come into your own," he said quietly, his voice almost approving. But Eleanor knew it wasn't just his approval she had gained. It was something deeper, something that came from within herself. The power shift was complete, and she was no longer the one who had been chosen. She was the one who had chosen. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the pressure lifting, but the aftermath of their moment lingered, a silent understanding passing between them. Eleanor had crossed a line, and now, as the Duke stood before her, she realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. She was no longer just the girl who had been swept into his world. She was the woman who would stand beside him, not behind him, not beneath him. She was his equal, and for the first time, she felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a gift, one she had earned, one she was ready to wield. The Duke's gaze softened once more, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes now, something that spoke of respect, of acknowledgement. "We will change this world together," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. The words echoed in her mind as they stood in the center of the ballroom, the crowd now watching not with judgment, but with curiosity. The game had changed. The power had shifted, and Eleanor Rivers was no longer just a player in the Duke's world. She was the game itself. The ballroom was eerily quiet now, the whispers fading into the background as Duke Alexander Knightley and Eleanor stood in the center, their presence commanding every ounce of attention in the room. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it felt as though the world around them had been redefined. The aristocrats who had once judged her, the women who had once made her feel small, were now watching her with something far different than disdain, curiosity, admiration, perhaps even envy. Eleanor could feel the weight of their gazes, but it no longer mattered. She was no longer the girl who had been overlooked, the one who had been dismissed. She was standing here, by the Duke's side, as his equal, as a force in her own right. Duke Knightley, though still a man of power and control, seemed to recognize the shift as well. His hand, warm against the small of her back, was steady, guiding her forward, but there was a subtle change in the way he moved. It wasn't the cold, calculating precision of earlier moments. There was something else now, something almost acknowledging. Eleanor's heart beat steadily in her chest, the rhythm calm and sure, but her mind was still racing, processing everything that had unfolded between them. She had come into this world not knowing where she stood, not knowing her place. But now, with every step she took beside the Duke, she understood. She had carved her place. She had earned it. The tension between them was still palpable, but it was no longer the dangerous, suffocating kind it had once been. Now, it was the tension of two forces in balance, each with their own power, each shaping the other. She was no longer just a reflection of his will. She was a part of his world, and in some ways, she was beginning to shape it as well. The room, once a place of judgment and whispers, now felt different. It felt like a stage, but the spotlight wasn't just on him anymore. It was on both of them. And Eleanor realized, as they moved through the crowd, that this was the beginning of something new. The Duke's hand slid from her back to her hand, and for the first time, she felt the true strength of their connection, not as master and servant, not as chosen and chooser, but as two people standing side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The aristocrats still watched, still waited for the next move, but Eleanor was no longer afraid. She didn't need to be. The Duke's influence was undeniable, but it wasn't the only thing that had brought her here. She had fought for this. She had earned her place beside him, and now the world could see it. The Duke's gaze flickered down at her, and for a moment, there was something softer in his eyes. It wasn't the cold, distant look he had once worn. It was something else, respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with something that wasn't just power. It was almost pride. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. His words were enough. They both knew the truth now. She had stepped into her own power, and nothing could take that away from her. The room shifted as they continued their path through the crowd, the whispers continuing, but now they were different. They weren't filled with disdain or judgment. They were filled with awe, with recognition of the new order that had been established. Eleanor, the once overlooked noblewoman, had risen, and she stood as an equal to the Duke, her presence no longer a shadow, but a force in its own right. As they reached the far side of the ballroom, Duke Knightley turned slightly, his gaze